She insulted a customer, only to realize he owned the place, and was Clint Eastwood. The midday sun streamed through the windows of Sierra Grill, a cozy yet bustling restaurant in Carmel by the Sea, California. It wasn't a high-end spot, but its rustic meets modern charm made it a local favorite, especially on a warm Thursday afternoon. For Megan, a 23-year-old waitress struggling to make ends meet, charm wasn't enough to ease her frustration. Her shift had been chaos from the moment she clocked in. "Table 7 needs extra dressing," a fellow server called out. Megan barely acknowledged them, too busy scribbling another order onto her notepad. Her ponytail swayed as she weaved through tables, juggling complaints about undercooked steaks, split checks, and forgotten drinks. On top of that, she'd dealt with 3 rude customers in the last hour, each leaving little more than a few coins as a tip. So when an elderly man strolled in and quietly took a seat at a corner table, Megan was already on edge. He didn't look like much. His flannel shirt was slightly wrinkled, his faded jeans well-worn, and his Stetson sat on the table beside him. His boots looked like they'd seen decades of dust and dirt roads. Megan gave him a once-over, smirking to herself. "Great," she muttered, under her breath. "Another one who's probably going to order a coffee and leave me $1. Still, she had a job to do. Her coworker nudged her and whispered, "You've got table 12. With a sigh, she grabbed her notepad, forced a smile, and walked over. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her voice tinged with impatience. The man looked up, his sharp eyes meeting hers. Something about him seemed oddly familiar, though Megan couldn't quite place it. "Just a burger," he said, his voice low and gravelly, carrying a quiet authority. "Burger. Got it. Anything else?" she asked, tapping her pen against the notepad. "No, ma'am," he replied, tipping his hat slightly. Megan rolled her eyes as she walked back to the kitchen. "Ma'am. Really?" she muttered. Yet something about him lingered in her mind. He wasn't like the other customers, rude, demanding, dismissive. There was a quiet confidence about him, as if he was watching and waiting for something. She shrugged it off. Another table, another order, another $1. When she returned with his burger, she set the plate down with little care, her exhaustion showing. "Here you go," she said, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Anything else?" The man glanced at his meal, then back at her. "No, this looks just fine. Thank you." His politeness made Megan oddly self-conscious. Something about his demeanor annoyed her. Maybe it was how calm he was. Everyone else in the restaurant was either complaining, snapping their fingers, or in a hurry. But not him. "You're not from around here, are you?" she blurted out, leaning on the edge of his table. "No, I'm not," he said simply, cutting his burger in half with precise movements. "Thought so," she said with a smirk. The hat gave it away. "Looks like you just stepped out of an old western." For the first time, the man smiled. Just a faint curve of his lips. "Something like that," he replied. Megan expected him to be annoyed, but he wasn't. That only irritated her more. She was tired of pretending, tired of biting her tongue. "You, no?" she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "Most people around here don't show up looking like they just came from a ranch." The man took a thoughtful bite of his burger, then, after a pause, said, "I guess I'm not most people." The weight of his words made Megan hesitate for the first time. A flicker of embarrassment crept in, but she quickly buried it. "Well, enjoy your meal," she said, pushing off the table and walking away before he could say anything else. She thought she'd had the last word. But as she cleared another table nearby, she noticed something. The man was watching her. That look made Megan feel as if she were being assessed, almost as if the man was quietly sizing her up. It wasn't harsh or judgmental, but there was something about it that unsettled her. She couldn't quite put her finger on why it bothered her so much, but that moment, that glance, would soon shift the course of her day and her life in ways she never could have imagined. As the lunch rush died down, the restaurant grew quieter. Megan finally had a chance to catch her breath. Leaning against the counter, she scrolled through her phone, absent-mindedly keeping an eye on her tables. Her gaze drifted to table 12, where the man was finishing his meal. He wasn't in a hurry. He sipped his water, glancing around the restaurant with a quiet curiosity. "Hey, Megan," her coworker Danny said as she passed by. "Isn't it weird how calm that guy is? Like he's just taking it all in?" Megan shrugged. "Yeah, well, some people have all the time in the world." Danny chuckled. "Maybe he's famous or something. Doesn't he look kind of familiar?" Megan rolled her eyes. "Famous? Yeah, right. And if he is, then I'm the Queen of England." Danny raised an eyebrow but let it go. Megan wasn't in the mood for speculation. Instead, she grabbed the check for table 12 and walked over, determined to keep the interaction short. "Here's your check," she said, placing it on the table with a polite, if somewhat forced, smile. "Whenever you're ready." The man glanced at the bill but didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, he looked up at her, his sharp eyes locking onto hers. "Do you enjoy your job?" he asked, his voice calm and deliberate. The question caught Megan off guard. She hesitated, her well-practiced smile faltering. "It's fine," she said with a shrug. "It's a job, you know?" He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "A job is what you make of it," he said after a moment. "But it seems like you're carrying a lot today." Megan felt her cheeks warm. Who was he to comment on her attitude? She crossed her arms. "Look, I've had a rough shift, okay? Not everyone gets to sit around eating burgers and handing out life advice." To her surprise, the man didn't seem offended. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Fair enough," he said. "But sometimes, how you treat people in those moments says more about you than you realize." Megan felt a flicker of irritation. Was he seriously lecturing her? She opened her mouth to fire back, but before she could, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his wallet, and stood. "I'll leave you with that thought," he said, placing a few bills on the table. "Thanks for the meal." As he walked toward the door, Megan muttered under her breath, "Yeah, whatever, cowboy." But just as he reached the exit, something unexpected happened. Carol, the no-nonsense manager, hurried out from the back office. Her face lit up the moment she spotted him, and she strode over with a warm smile, extending her hand. "Mr. Eastwood, I wasn't expecting you today." Megan froze. Her stomach dropped. "Eastwood? Clint Eastwood?" Her head snapped toward the door just in time to see him turn back briefly to shake Carol's hand. His eyes met hers again, this time with a knowing look before he walked out the door. Megan stood rooted to the spot, her notepad clutched tightly in her hand. Did I really just brush off Clint Eastwood? The Clint Eastwood? And not just that. He owned the restaurant. Her pulse pounded as Carol turned to her, completely unaware of Megan's internal meltdown. "Megan," Carol beamed. "Can you believe it? Mr. Eastwood stopped by today. He's been so busy lately, I haven't seen him in weeks." Megan's throat went dry. Yeah, that's... wow." Carol didn't seem to notice her distress. She was too busy gushing. "You know, this place means the world to him. He's so hands-on. Every little detail here he's personally approved. That's why we always remind the staff to bring their best. You never know when he'll stop by." Megan felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Her mind raced, replaying every word she had said to him, every smirk, every eye roll. Her face burned with embarrassment. Danny, still watching her, nudged her gently. "You okay?" I think I need a minute," Megan muttered before quickly, slipping into the break room. As soon as the door shut behind her, she let out a shaky breath and sank into a chair. How had she been so oblivious? She'd worked at the Sierra Grill for 2 years, and in all that time she had never once paid attention to the stories about the restaurant's elusive owner. If she had, maybe she would have recognized him. Or, at the very least, she might have thought twice before running her mouth. Her thoughts were spinning, but one question stood out. What now? What Megan didn't know was that Clint Eastwood wasn't done with her just yet. The next day, she arrived at work with a knot of anxiety twisting in her stomach. She'd barely slept, replaying the events of the previous day over and over in her mind. Every time she thought about the calm way Clint Eastwood had looked at her before walking out, she cringed. What if he told Carol about her attitude? What if she got fired? She couldn't afford to lose this job, not with rent due in 2 weeks and student loans piling up. For the first half of her shift, she avoided eye contact with Carol and threw herself into her work. She smiled, apologized quickly when necessary, and refilled drinks before customers even had to ask. It was more effort than she'd put into her job in months. By the time the lunch rush was in full swing, the restaurant buzzed with activity. Megan was wiping down a table when she heard it, that unmistakable gravelly voice she hadn't been able to forget. "Well, looks like you're busy today." Her breath caught. She turned sharply to see Clint Eastwood standing near the counter, hands casually tucked into his pockets. He was dressed much the same as the day before, but this time, his presence felt even more commanding. Her heart sank. She forced a nervous smile, scrambling for something to say. Mr. Eastwood. Hi, I didn't know you'd be back so soon." He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I like to check in on my places from time to time. Keeps everyone on their toes." Megan swallowed hard, her palms suddenly clammy. "Right. Well, everything's running great today." He nodded, glancing around the restaurant. "I see that, but you seem a little tense." She froze. Of course he noticed. He probably noticed everything. About yesterday, He held up a hand, cutting her off. "No need to apologize," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not here to make—" Megan hesitated, unsure how to respond. "Oh, thank you," she said finally. "I don't really know what brought it on." Carol smiled. "Whatever it is, keep it up. The customers have noticed too. One even left a comment card the other day praising your service." Megan felt a rush of surprise and for the first time in a while a flicker of pride. She hadn't expected anyone to notice the effort she'd been making, let alone appreciate it. As she left the office, a small smile played at her lips. She still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was on the right path. That night, as she locked up the restaurant, her eyes drifted to the sign out front. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a place where she could grow, learn, and maybe, even in small ways, make a difference. And she owed it all to the quiet cowboy who had walked in one busy afternoon and left her with a lesson she'd never forget. Because sometimes, the smallest moments leave the biggest impact, and every day is a chance to be just a little better than before. As Megan walked home that night, the crisp evening air carried a sense of renewal. She had spent so long going through the motions, treating each shift like a countdown to the end of the day. But now something felt different. She wasn't just clocking in and out. She was showing up, really showing up. The next few weeks brought more of the same. She made an effort to be patient, to listen, to engage with customers in a way she never had before. It didn't go unnoticed. Regulars started greeting her by name. A couple of coworkers commented on how she seemed less grumpy lately, which made her laugh. Even Carol, who rarely gave out compliments, nodded approvingly when she caught Megan going the extra mile. One afternoon, as she was refilling a coffee cup for an older gentleman at table 6, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Looks like you're getting the hang of it." She turned around, and there he was, Clint Eastwood, standing near the entrance, watching her with that same unreadable expression. Megan straightened instinctively. "Mr. Eastwood," she said, clearing her throat. "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I like to check in," he said simply. She wasn't sure what to say, but to her surprise, she didn't feel the same knot of anxiety in her stomach this time. Instead, she felt something else, pride. "Well," she said, "I hope you're hungry. We've got a fresh batch of burgers that I'm pretty sure even you would approve of." A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "I'll take your word for it." As she led him to a table, she realized something. The last time he'd walked into the restaurant, she had seen him as just another customer, maybe even an inconvenience. But now she understood. Some people come into your life to challenge you, others to inspire you, and some, like Clint Eastwood, do both. And Megan? She was finally ready to rise to the occasion.